Stalin section, Abolitionist Revolutions and the Demonization of the Anti-Whites and the Barbarians. The comparative approach can once again help clarify the underlying logic of these ideological processes. There are three great revolutionary movements that, in different ways, had radically challenged the slavery or semi-slavery of the colonial regime, and the racist regime of white supremacy that existed at both the national and international level. We must first consider the Great Revolution by black slaves that broke out in Saint-Domingue in the wake of the French Revolution. Led by Toussaint Louverture, the, quote, Black Jacobin, that revolution leads to Saint-Domingue's Haiti's Declaration of Independence, the first country in the Americas to shake off the institution of slavery. The second great revolutionary movement is that which in the United States, following abolitionist agitation and the American Civil War, leads to the establishment of a multiracial society for a brief period of time, the years of Reconstruction, within which the newly freed blacks enjoy not only full civil rights, but also political rights. Lastly, we must reference the October Revolution that calls upon the colonial slaves to break their chains, and that powerfully encourages those that until then were considered the inferior races in the struggle for decolonization and emancipation. All of these three great movements suffered, and still in part suffer, summary liquidation or their confinement to the darkness or shadows of history. Let's take the revolution led by Toussaint Louverture. In the first decades of the 19th century, those who are sympathetic to it are called, quote, anti-white and murderers. Regarding Saint-Domingue, Tocqueville merely alludes to the, quote, bloody catastrophe that had put an end to its existence. Paradoxically, the island ceases to exist at the very moment in which it puts an end to, for the first time on the American continent, the institution of slavery. But to reconstruct the atmosphere of that time, it's perhaps necessary to specifically cite a popular novel by Heinrich von Kleist, The Betrothal in Santo Domingo, set at the start of the 19th century, quote, when blacks killed whites and carried out a massacre of whites in the name of a disorienting generalized revenge, end quote. The criminalization of this great revolution went unchallenged for a long time. It continued on into the start of the 20th century with Lothrop Stoddard. Together with the revolution by black slaves in Saint-Domingue, the theorist of white supremacy also condemns the second and third stages represented by the anti-slavery and anti-czarist struggles, and naturally brands as traitors to the white race the French Jacobins, the American supporters of radical abolition and the cause of racial equality, as well as the Bolsheviks. With respect to so-called Reconstruction, one must have in mind the warning from an eminent American historian, quote, despite its military defeat, the South won the ideological Civil War a long time ago, end quote. It would appear that, at least in this case, there should be no doubt. After centuries of slavery in the fullest sense of the word, Reconstruction is forced to make way to a regime of anti-black terror so ferocious that it can be identified as the most tragic moment in African American history. However, let's see how Wilson summarizes that time in history. Quote, the household slaves were almost always indulgently and even warmly treated by their masters, end quote. In the wake of emancipation, Reconstruction sets in, during which majorities are formed in the South that rely on blacks. It's, quote, an incredible carnival of public crime to which the natural and inevitable rise of the whites fortunately puts an end, end quote. A figure who went on to enter the pantheons of the United States and the West is not filled with horror at the time when the slave owner exercises absolute power over his human cattle, nor is it the time when the regime of white supremacy organizes the public spectacle of lynching and the slow martyrdom of the former slaves. Synonymous with public crime is the brief period of time that followed the American Civil War, and during which there's the effort, despite everything, to take the human rights of African Americans seriously. For a time, Black Reconstruction, or Radical Reconstruction, had been considered synonymous with totalitarianism, or as the phenomenon that preceded fascism and Nazism. Imposed at the conclusion of a war that was very similar to the, quote, total war by the Nazis, it had intended to forcefully realize the principle of equality and racial intermixing, tramping on the will of the white majority, and appealing to the savage population, with a consequent, quote, victory achieved through physical force by civilization over barbarism, end quote. Fortunately, the stainless and fearless knights of the Ku Klux Klan were ready to challenge or contain those horrors. The KKK was the organization that kept alive the, quote, knightly order that had for so long characterized the U.S. South. These are the themes that are promoted by a historiography that continued to make its influence felt well after the collapse of the Third Reich. Finally, the events that began in October 1917, with the appeal directed to the colonial slaves to break their chains, culminated with the arrival of Stalin's autocracy. Naturally, it's not in any way a matter of idealizing the protagonists of these three great emancipatory struggles. An eminent historian on the revolution by black slaves in San Domingue argued against, quote, the contemporary legend according to which the abolition of slavery had meant the extermination of the whites, end quote. But it's undeniable that massacres took place on both sides. Nor is there doubt about the brutality, at that time unprecedented, with which the American Civil War was carried out by the North, and particularly by Sherman, who explicitly proposed striking at the civilian population and to, quote, make Georgia howl. And it's no coincidence that Hitler appears to look to him as a model. Finally, the ruthless nature of the dictatorship maintained first by Lenin, and especially by Stalin later, is not up for debate. At least the Second War brought up here now appears to have been lost by the slave-owning South in the field of history as well. It is no longer politically correct to regret the end of slavery or the regime of white supremacy. In contrast, commonplace is the understanding of, quote, Stalinism, in the history of the October Revolution, as merely criminal, as well as the comparison of Stalin to Hitler, who, inheriting and radicalizing the colonial tradition, explicitly demanded the right of the, quote, master race to decimate and enslave the inferior races. It's a sign that the champions of colonialism still haven't lost the battle at either the political level or in the field of history. End of section.